Good evening, and thanks for joining us for what we hope is the first of many public discussions hosted by the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. So I'm Jeff Woodkey, one of the associate directors at the Stone Center, and it's my pleasure to open this evening's event titled Conversations on Inequality in Public Policy, where we'll discuss one of the most divisive policies of our time, affirmative action. So this policy is rooted, I believe, in a desire to create a more just and equal society, but it nevertheless remains a subject of vibrant debate and diverse opinion. So in the spirit of academic inquiry, the Stone Center is committed to illuminating the many different dimensions of socioeconomic inequality with rigor and also with an unwavering commitment to empirical evidence. So through research and public discourse, our center aims to craft a more complete picture of how factors like class, gender, and race and policy intertwine to shape opportunities and outcomes. So tonight, we'll pursue this commitment by presenting you with two esteemed voices, Professors Durlauf and Lowry, who each bring a wealth of knowledge and a unique perspective to the table, offering us a truly rare opportunity to confront the complexities of affirmative action policies and their link with inequalities, both past and present. To navigate this discussion, we're fortunate to have Professor Ethan Bueno De Mesquita as our moderator, interim dean of the Harris School and Sidney Stein professor. Ethan is renowned for his research into political violence, national security, and electoral accountability, which has guided contemporary thought on political strategy. His intellectual career, underpinned, I'm sure, by his early education at the University of Chicago, is marked by an unyielding pursuit of clarity on the link between theory, empirics, and social policy, and thus he's ideally suited to steer tonight's conversation. So as we embark on this discussion, I hope that we can embrace the diversity of thought, the rigor of academic debate, and a shared commitment to understanding, all of which, are principles that we aspire to here at U of C. Let's try to listen, question, consider, with an openness to the possibility that our own positions, whatever they are, might be mistaken. In the social sciences, I think certainty in our prior beliefs is a troublesome illusion. So with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor Bueno De Mesquita, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good evening. It's amazing to see so many people in the forum. It's great to see you here. I'm Ethan Bueno De Mesquita. I'm the interim dean of the Harris School and a longtime faculty member here. And it's just such a pleasure to be here to moderate this conversation on affirmative action presented by the Stone Center and the Harris School. It's exciting to be here at this inaugural conversation. The Stone Center for the Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility is dedicated to this idea that we can take evidence and analysis and think about and talk about society's most difficult challenges, echoing both the Harris School and the University of Chicago's fundamental commitment to the idea that we can sit together and talk civilly about even the most difficult of topics in the hopes that rigor and honesty will lead us, if not to agreement, at least to understanding. It's also a real honor to be joined here today by Steven Durlauf and Glenn Lowry. I'm going to just on a personal note, it's just like a real thrill for me. I would say I don't want to comment on relative ages, but when I was a young graduate student, if you had asked me who were the 5 scholars doing the kind of work that made me want to be an academic, work that took rigor really seriously, that was broadly intellectual, and was working on the most important questions about society, for sure that list of 5 names would have had Steven Durlauf and Lowry on it. So to be here with the two of them, to get to moderate this debate is just a personal thrill. That's the kind of thing that's thrilling to a professor. So thanks for being here.
All right, young fellow.
So by way of brief introduction, Steven Durlauf, my Harris colleague, who's the Steens Professor of Education Policy. He's the director for the Stone Center. He's a pioneering scholar and a proponent for big social science who's advanced economic theory, econometric methods, and made substantive contributions to our understanding of poverty, inequality, economic growth, and so much more. Thanks, Steven, for asking me to moderate today's panel. What dean wouldn't want to get to moderate a panel on affirmative action? What could go wrong? Glenn Lowry joins us from Brown University, where he serves as the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences. Professor Lowry has made fundamental contributions to our understanding of economic theory, to the economics of racial inequality, social policy. Did I mention economic theory? He's also a prominent public intellectual who's written on all manner of important topics, including affirmative action, racial inequality, and a variety of other topics. A towering figure in the current American discourse. Welcome to Harris and to the Keller Center. All right, so we're going to talk about affirmative action. We're going to hear from 2 great scholars with differing viewpoints, see what we can learn from one another, have a conversation, and hopefully come away with greater understanding. So let's get started.
I think I'm going first here, and we're having a conversation, not a debate. I noticed that. I like that. And I also like this focus on rigor and evidence and and fallibility, the very possibility that a person might be wrong. Imagine someone could change their mind as a result of a discussion of a controversial issue. It's an exciting prospect, not one I'm all that familiar with in my experience in talking about this issue. So the court has decided this case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC. It's a watershed moment. I'm not a legal scholar, but anybody can see that this is a really, really big deal. Talking about age, I was made to think of the fact that I've been, if you will, dealing with the issue of affirmative action my entire adult life, and I'm 75 years old. That's a half century. It's a long time. I think the question before us as a society is whether at this watershed moment where the court has spoken, we want to double down on what we've been doing, or we want to think differently about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish. And I want to encourage the latter. I want to encourage not for or against, but thinking carefully about what the relative costs, benefits, and other considerations are as we carry ourselves forward into the 21st century. I'm not going to filibuster. I'm going to get to the point. I've got some problems with affirmative action as a permanent way of ensuring an adequate representation of African American and Latino in elite, highly competitive, highly selective intellectual venues. I get the historical necessity of a departure from what might have been a baseline presupposition of non-racial discrimination. I get why that was a necessary passage through which we had to go. My concerns have to do with making it a institutionalized and permanent mechanism for dealing with an important historical problem. What's the historical problem? Namely that African American and other development of our full human potential has been, in many complicated ways, impeded by structures of oppression, exclusion, and racism characteristic of American history. That's the problem. That impeded development has to be reckoned with in its own terms. Changing the standards of assessment and evaluation so as to ensure representation begs that question. It does not address the development issue, and that's a deep concern for me. So I'm thinking that, suppose the court had decided the other way. Different president, different history, it could easily have gone the other way. What might be some of the concerns that I think would be important to bring to the fore? I'd have concerns about my country. We are not a static society. We are a dynamic and evolving and complex and diverse society. We're not just black and white anymore, haven't been for decades. That it was Asian American students bringing this lawsuit is not just ironic, it's deeply revealing about the tectonic plates of American social demography shifting into the 21st century. We don't want to marry ourselves to an institutionalized practice of racial discrimination in such an environment, I hold. We want to be flexible, we want to be open, we want to keep our institutions open, and we don't want to get into this business of defining people in these categories and then having different terms of assessment of them. This is my position, this is what I'm concerned about. I don't think that's good for America. I also don't think that the relaxation of standards attendant to the practice of racial discrimination on behalf of the objective of securing African American representation is good for the university. I'm going to use the word merit here. I'm going to call our attention to the fact that in these precious institutions, such as the one that we're inhabiting right now, rarefied, difficult, challenging, sublimely beautiful, but difficult intellectual work is to be done. The idea that we would, for example, get rid of the use of standardized tests as an instrument of assessment of the preparation and fitness of people for inclusion within our community, to get rid of it because we don't like the incidence of its deployment. We don't like the fact that when we use it, it's information after all. When we rely on that information, it's not a Rosetta Stone, it's not a be-all and end-all of a person's worth, but it tells us something about what abilities to perform intellectual work have been acquired and mastered in the individuals being assessed. The idea that we would get rid of that on behalf of the goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to my mind, is a profound mistake. We go like this: I'd rather not know, because in going like this, I'm able to secure a diverse outcome. I think it's a mistake. Bad for the country. This is the 21st century, not the 20th century, and certainly not the 19th century. There are a lot of people here in this country. It's dynamic, the world is competitive, et cetera. Bad for the university. It is a meritocratic institution. This is an elite institution. What we do here and in places like this, not everyone is equally capable of doing. We have to make judgments. Those judgments need to be made in such a manner as to preserve the standards that we uphold of excellence and performance within our context. And I would say, at the end of the day, marrying ourselves to the use of differential standards of assessment is bad for Black people. Equity, meant by which I would mean something close to proportionate representation, is not the same thing as equality, by which I mean an equality of performance, an equality of respect, an equality of standing, an equality of dignity. there's no way that you can use substantially different thresholds of intellectual performance when you're making an admissions decision by race and not have there be, on average, differences in the performance of those subject to your admissions process after the admissions decision has been made. If the criteria of assessment, the test scores, the grades, the letters of recommendation, the extracurricular activities, the essays, the interviews, are correlated with post-admissions performance, and you use different, lower, less exacting, less demanding criteria for one group than another, it's a statistical necessity that on the average, you're going to get different performance after the admissions decision has been made. That's not my opinion. The criteria are correlated with post-admissions performance. The criteria are applied differently, substantially differently in terms of the assessment of those who are applying for inclusion. You're going to get differences on average in performance after the fact. That's not good. That's not equality. That doesn't address the underlying problem that has been evidenced by the difference in the instruments of assessment, namely, as I've alluded to, the historical legacy of a impeded development. This is a population I'm talking about, not individual persons, but on the average of impeded development of people to do what is the raison d'etre of the institution: solve hard problems, read difficult text, formulate complex argument, articulate your ideas, learn what has been cherished within the various canons that we develop and celebrate here within this institution. That's what we're here to do. And that's where I am going to leave my concerns with you here. Bad for the country, bad for the university, bad for Black people ourselves, that we would make permanent and institutionalize the practice of using different criteria to assess the fitness of people based upon their race.
That's a tough act to follow. There's so many important and good arguments. So let me try to frame an affirmative case for affirmative action that I hope it will reflect many of the ideas Glenn put on the table, and then I want to indicate why at the end I come to somewhat different conclusions about particular policies. For me, the first ethical consideration in thinking about affirmative action has to do with the nature of inequality in American society and the overwhelming fact of the historic mistreatment of African Americans having contemporary consequences. This is such an evil that is, for me, primary in terms of asking how can something be rectified. So when I think about affirmative action, I start from the same position that Glenn does, which is we have many structures which historically were the generators of injustices, and whether or not they're contemporarily doing so, the current structures cause inequalities to be very persistent. In other words, there's bottlenecks in the society in which it's difficult for families, for communities to get through them across time. And so I condition any discussion about policy as asking how do we open these bottlenecks up? How do we create fair equality of opportunity, which, following the standard definition, is that individuals, all offices, opportunities are available to them, but you recognize that for unjust reasons, there's differentials in terms of the background they bring to them. So I think we're on the same, we're on the same page there. And the question is, which portfolio of policies will be most effective in addressing that? And Glenn has put something that's absolutely essential on the table, and that is that the fact of differential test scores demands policy interventions. In other words, it isn't sufficient to say, well, these mechanisms are in place that have caused these inequalities up to age 18, and consequently we simply ignore them. That, in some sense, ideal justice would demand the elimination of those inequalities. And so I'm speaking from the non-ideal perspective of asking, in this society, what ought to be done. And so in my judgment, one of the tools for addressing these persistent inequalities is affirmative action. And that's really what conditions how I think about the problem. The second thing I would say is that in any discussion of affirmative action, not only do we have to think about the ethics from the perspective of society and its that's historical injustices and what's going to be addressed today, we have to think about fairness and justice from the perspective of individuals. And so really that puts a couple of things on the table. Number one, Glenn brought up the issue of merit. And so if you think about my description of how I want to organize this, think about policies, I was focusing on responsibility. In other words, a standard idea that unjust inequalities are those that derive from factors a person is not responsible for. But that's not sufficient to describe us as human beings. We have other ideas, which are that certain things are merited and certain things are deserved. And so I think any affirmative argument for affirmative action has to address these issues. And I think that and address them doesn't mean it will successfully rebut them, but nevertheless, they should be on the table. And here I would make a few arguments. Number one, I do think it is important not to treat grades and test scores as really clean signals. And what I mean by that is that merit and desert are prospective, not retrospective. And so if I really had a mechanical system that rewarded grades and test scores, that's a retrospective one. And then we have to ask the prospective question. In order to answer that, we now have to go to a new question, which is what is a university supposed to accomplish? Now, Glenn put on the table that one of the things that a university should accomplish, and I agree, it's fundamental, you can't define a university without it, it is scholarly excellence. It's the pursuit of truth. These may sound like banalities to some, it may sound corny to others. They are fundamental to what a university is. And so there, I think I would make a couple of arguments. One of them is that from that vantage point, the individual admissions decisions probably have something to do with value added. And so in other words, if I'm trying to maximize the total truth generation that's produced from different configurations of people, I don't just look at who they are in isolation and have a sort of matching of the highest test scores of the most elite schools. I do want to ask something about value added, and that leads to a very different set of criteria. And if Glenn and I were going to bring a blackboard out with some equations, we would say this condition has to hold for that to produce the outcome I referred to and not. But the point is, I think that I want to at least partially rebut the assumption, the view that from prospective meritocratic considerations, grades and test scores should be reified as being particularly important. That said, there is informational content, and I 100% agree it was a terrible mistake of this institution to drop the mandatory SAT. I find it incomprehensible to throw information out. In other words, you take information and you address it, you interpret it in the context of individuals. You don't just say we're going to turn a blind eye to it and refuse to consider it. So I want to say that I think that we do have to think prospectively about meritocracy, and that leads to questions as to what value added is. Once we go down the value added route, that now leads to this question of to what extent are there intrinsic values of diversity at institutions. And there, my judgment on this is that evidence depends on the context you're asking. If somebody said, is that true for producing mathematical theorems, I don't think there's any evidence of that. On the other hand, if you ask, does the lived experience of African Americans profoundly influence the way that I understand history, policy, criminology, literature, I'd say absolutely yes. And so part of what I would put on the table is in thinking about what people bring to institutions, that the merit itself is multidimensional, but we have to be respectful of the limits to information and not engage in some of the overclaiming that I think universities did. And as Ethan and I have talked about, they did in response to Supreme Court strictures on restricting the justifications to meritocracy, to intrinsic values of diversity. But nevertheless, I think there are values there, and that is something that one has to focus on. I could push the argument farther in a couple of directions. One of them is I think that there's persuasive empirical evidence, in my opinion, of the influence, for example, of black doctors on black patients. In other words, there's something about the composition of professional communities that matters in terms of group inequalities. I think there's other evidence about the importance of black teachers for black students, and I find these studies overall persuasive. And so that says to me that the assessment of the value added of an individual isn't just going to be what they changed, let's say, in their SAT, metaphorically, were they to take it at the ages of 17 and 22, but rather what life courses they're going to be on, and I see much value there. The other thing I would emphasize, and this is really going back to research that Glenn pioneered in his work on the dynamic theory of black-white income differences, and I've spent a lot of my own career working on models of social interactions and mobility, that that perspective says that if you think about individual contributions to a society or to a university, you have to respect the complicated social structures in which there's members, of which they are members. When we find evidence, for example, that modest interventions at the University of Texas, literally 1 hour interventions where students of color are asked to read through scenarios of upperclassmen describing to them kind of the difficulties of being in school, that intervention can reduce the black-white grade gap by 50%. That's a statement about something about social structures and about how we want to organize institutions, and we need to have vibrant communities of people of color in order to provide the sort of support that that generates. I will tell you, the first time I heard this study, I honestly didn't believe it. In other words, I just found it not credible. 1 hour, 4 years later, you find the evidence. But it says something, and this is the reason I'm bringing this up, that I think is extremely important. In thinking about individual developmental trajectories, they themselves are comprised of deeply nonlinear positive reinforcement processes, to use the algebra you know I'm dying to scribble on the paper. But they say something deep, which is there's periods in time when shocks have extremely persistent effects. The first time one takes a calculus class and gets a C, what's the interpretation? I don't belong here, or I need to work harder, or I went to a lousy high school. And so I think that that's simply one example of where I see that if we have a vision of the elimination of these skills gaps, we have to take very seriously and deeply focus on the fact that individuals are involved in all these complicated interconnections, and that we're all, in some sense, linked through identity, through aspirations, through the way that self-confidence works, et cetera. And so from that vantage point, I see important benefits to the communities of students at universities from affirmative action. I could even push that a little bit farther with the work that Caroline Hawksby and Christopher Avery have done on Undermatch, where they identified thousands of high school seniors with excellent test scores, good grades. They would get scholarships had they applied to elite universities. They don't do that. How does one rectify that? It's by creating role models. It's creating social networks. It's bringing people in who are from communities where people didn't normally go to college, et cetera. Now, these are all very micro examples, but my assessment of the overall situation is that in thinking about affirmative action, a first order issue is the creation of communities, social networks, information flows, forms of support, et cetera. And all of those, I think, speak to the desirability of keeping this as a significant policy for some duration. But I want to repeat, that does not justify dropping test scores. It is not a statement about quotas. And it is part and parcel of recognizing that the ideal goal is not to need the policy.
All right, there's a lot there. That was a lot. Okay. Let me start this way. So it seems to me in both of your comments, you pull out a large variety of kinds of arguments about, so I, in some sense, you both are accepting the kind of quasi-consequentialist framework that Glenn had at the beginning, and so let's just think about costs and benefits and see where the balance is. But the costs and benefits that you're considering are themselves quite diverse, and some of them are like practical social outcomes kind of things that we're often used to, and some of them are more justice-y things. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of think about like, what are the set of values we're talking about here? Because I want to try and get at, deep down, is your disagreement in your conclusion about which values get more weight? Or is your disagreement about facts? Is your disagreement about sort of the balance of effects as an empirical matter in the world we live in, that you agree on values and you disagree on where the empirical evidence points us? So let me pull out for you at least 5 values that I hear you talking about, each of you. So one is kind of a justice consideration about, there's kind of 2, but let's focus on something about equality of outcomes. Equality of opportunity, and whether universities have an obligation to participate in some kind of rectification and achieving of equality of opportunity. I'll leave aside equity and equality of outcomes for a moment. Another different kind of argument is about, in particular, the effect of affirmative action on Black people. And so I hear arguments about things like the indignity of special pleading, or mismatch between the institution to which you're admitted and the institution to which you're best suited on the one hand, and arguments about embedding in professional networks that lead to success, serving a community, et cetera. So there's a bunch of arguments about, in particular, the interests of the black community or black individuals at universities, which is a different argument, I think, than the equality of opportunity argument and the justice mandates of rectification. Another kind of argument I hear you making is kind of a family of arguments that were handed to universities by the Supreme Court's Bakke decision about the impact of diversity on the university's mission of research and teaching. That is to say, do we in fact do a better job of truth-seeking and truth dissemination in diverse environments, or do we do a better job of truth-seeking and truth communicating in, to use Glenn's language, sort of purely meritocratic environments? And Stephen, you came down on the side of like, well, I'm not sure about theorem proving, but there's a bunch of settings where I think actually, if I'm thinking about social policy and I'm in a completely non-diverse classroom, I'm gonna miss a lot. So I think there's a question about, as a pragmatic matter, do we do a better job of the actual mission of the university in diverse environments or not, which is, interestingly, almost the only thing universities themselves talk about, because it's what the Supreme Court told us we're allowed to talk about. And so it's what we talk about. And then there were some questions about sort of the social benefits of diversity and the way in which, by training a diverse set of students to go out into the world, we serve society in various ways, which is yet another value from equality of opportunity or doing better research or rectifying injustices. So I guess I want to start by saying it seems to me that you disagree to some extent on those values, that you wouldn't both endorse all of those. And so I want to start there before we get to facts and just ask sort of, as you think about those things, are those all good and we're hoping all good things go together, or are those some of those you would object to as values we should be putting positive weight on as we think about our cost-benefit analysis?
Okay, I'll respond. I agree with Steve that history casts a long shadow, that the dynamics of social attainment and individual development, the way families and communities work, networks, as he says, the externalities and the acquisition of skills that are mediated through the way that people are knitted together with one another is a real and important thing. I mean, that, you know, my PhD thesis at MIT, 1976.
I was thinking about asking the first question about your 1978 paper on resource extraction, but I didn't think the crowd would be interested.
He was too young for 76 paper.
Made the argument in that thesis, I made the argument that, you know, you could have a history of discrimination and then you could have a transition into a period in which discrimination ceased, and you could ask the question whether the effects of the historical discrimination would wash away over time if the market were open and everybody would be treated fairly. And I argue, well, not necessarily, so long as some of the mechanisms of people's achieving skills was mediated through these social connectivities, which were not themselves open to non-discrimination. People are connecting with each other in part based on racial and other ethnic identities. And so history casts a long shadow. We should be concerned about that. It doesn't follow from that I want to choose my entering class at the University of Chicago based upon some ideal racial composition of that class. So the step between those two things is a big step, it seems to me. I also want to say I share the value that I gave a characterization of what the university is for: a bunch of smart people getting to the bottom of things, solving problems, reading hard books, writing hard books. You got to be really, really smart to do that well, this kind of idea. And he says, well, wait, that's not self-evident. Maybe what a university is for is producing the greatest benefit to society from increasing the productivity of the people who come in. And if they cherry pick those who are already the most accomplished, they may well constitute a class that's quote unquote excellent, but they will have done little to advance that goal of increasing the overall productivity. I think that's true. I'd say further in that spirit that it's not at all obvious that the incentives are right. I mean, each institution wants to be quote unquote the best. They don't want to maximize value added. They want to maximize the absolute level. And so they might compete with one another in ways that would undermine the goal of maximizing value. So I acknowledge that. But there are other values. Is non-racial discrimination a value? Is the seeing people in their full humanity and not as instruments on behalf of a social program, not as representatives of these racial aggregates a value? I think so. So that was about values. There's also about evidence. What did Robert say in his controlling opinion? He says, doesn't pass strict scrutiny. He says, not narrowly tailored to meet compelling government objectives. What are those objectives? Well, you say diversity, and Steven cited a little bit of evidence, but he says this is not amenable to a court's judicial review. This is very speculative. It's very hard to know what comprehensive and compelling evidence on behalf of these claims would be. He says, you can't, it's a zero-sum game. You can't have an idea that I got to get 10% or 12% of the one group without having an idea that I've got to limit the representation of another group. These numbers have to add up to one. If I have underrepresentation, I have overrepresentation. There's no way to construe this. You look at the data from Harvard about the conditional probability of admissions controlling for academic accomplishment in the record, and you see that there are wildly different rates by race in those probabilities. If you were to flip the script on that and have blacks disadvantaged to that extent in some endeavor in which you could have objective assessments of people's relative performance, and you saw those kind of differences, you would say racial discrimination. Well, if racial discrimination is wrong, it's wrong. It's not just wrong sometimes. It's wrong. It's a violation of certain principles about how it is that we should conduct our affairs together in this very diverse society. So I'd add that to the list of things that we might not have the same.
Is that to say that if there was super convincing evidence, like let's just imagine the world where there's super convincing evidence that the kind of team diversity theory of knowledge production was true, that we produce way better science in diverse teams than in non-diverse teams, but in order to get to diverse teams, we had to engage in affirmative action at the admissions stage, you would say we ought not do it?
I'd say that that's a wild hypothetical. Really?
You could imagine evidence. I don't know which way it's going to go, but you could imagine for people.
Scott Page, the political scientist who's written a book about the
suppose that
value
book
of
was
diversity
great.
and whatnot, and all this kind of computer science stuff about how groups solve problems and the algorithmics. So I'd have to reconsider if the evidence was strong enough.
So I think one area of disagreement was on the objectives of a university. That seems to me pretty clear. Glenn emphasized the creation of knowledge at the frontier, and that's a certain, and I said that deserves enormous value. I emphasized other things. One of them was the production of members of society, and in terms of what they did in the labor market, what they did in terms of being members of communities. I don't actually see that deep a contradiction between them. In other words, as I see an institution like Chicago or the Ivy League school that you're at and the ones that I attended earlier in life, you have heterogeneous student bodies because you have heterogeneous objectives. In other words, the extraordinarily talented students you admit because part of your objective is to produce the new Nobel laureates and Fields Medal winners. Another objective, I would have said for my alma mater, was it wants to produce presidents of the United States. That's another thing. It's the same institution that wants to have musicians, artists, people who achieve things that did not have high test scores per se. And so I think that I would shift the ground in the debate. I don't want to use the word debate, but in the discussion, because I would want to emphasize, I think much of what you're seeking is done in actual admissions practices because the truly extraordinary students are being admitted. The issue with respect to affirmative action policies is who are the marginal students that aren't being admitted. And there, I think the evidence is less strong that they would have done substantially, qualitatively different things than the students that have been admitted. The important caveat to that is work such as Pierre Arcidiacono's, who's made arguments that
Arcidiacono.
I should have said it correctly since I was one of his teachers in graduate school.
Yes.
I apologize. Who, and the particular evidence that he found was that at Duke, students who were admitted under affirmative action plans were not majoring in STEMs. They were majoring in particular humanities. I think that's actually a very important caveat to affirmative action policies, but I maybe interpret it differently, and that is something about the incompleteness. I would say something that in my entire career just deeply troubled me about the policies of the institutions I've been at, which were Stanford and Wisconsin. I'm not going to say Chicago because I don't know the undergraduates here well enough, so I want to be clear that I'm not, is that there was an attitude that if you admit somebody, there's a tabula rasa, it didn't matter where you came from. But there's an irreducible fact. People from disadvantaged backgrounds went to worse high schools. They came from different worlds. And the universities do astonishingly little, in my judgment, to address that. But I think that's addressable. One possibility, for example, is take MIT. MIT has pass-fail courses its freshman year for a very good reason, because people come in with extremely different scientific backgrounds. And so, to me, the issue that's brought up by Peter and others in terms of mismatch is a statement of the incompleteness of the policy in isolation. That's a little bit utopian to say that because I'm asserting the existence of the alternative policies. And I would say that pass-fail grades as freshmen, I actually have some more fanciful ideas about making colleges 5 years in which you have kind of a freshman year that's partially designed to equalize the students' backgrounds, but that's a different conversation. But I think that's part of what I would say there. The other thing that I would probably emphasize is I do see a value to producing citizens. Now, in saying it that way, it also suggests there may be different ethical criteria for private universities than public universities. In other words, from the vantage point of the University of Illinois, I would say that a first-order issue is you are producing members of your society, which means you want people that are going to be informed, reasoned voters and understand the world that they're participating in. Similarly, you wish to have an institution where the taxpayers of the state, in some sense, are all represented over time in terms of the enrollments. I wouldn't make, the arguments are somewhat different for schools like Chicago. And so I think that a lot of the disagreements, I think that you hear were implicit that I have in a more amorphous conception of what the universities ought to do. I will disagree with one thing you said, Ethan. I actually think that if it came across, I didn't do a good job. The first argument I was making was not consequentialist. I think, to me, a just society is minimizing the predictability of certain inequalities because that's what violates fair equality of opportunity in a deontological sense. And so that's why I started by saying that's how I frame everything. And so for me, kind of the stylized facts that one starts with is test score convergence seems to have stopped in the late 1980s. Wage convergence stopped somewhere in the early 1990s. Work that I'm doing with Kyuhyun Kim and Shi Song, we're looking at occupational mobility and convergence. It's absolutely astonishing. There's only one decade in the last 20 years where there was convergence. It's the 60s. And so it's against that background that I'm really pushing against that predictability.
That's before affirmative action, by the way.
I know, yes. And so I'm very, it's really a remarkable fact that.
Well, let me ask you, because I'm listening. And I'm wondering, I'm asking myself, okay, what's this got to do with race? We're talking about disadvantage. Race and disadvantage are not the same thing. And this is not class versus race. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is we can treat individuals as full people. We don't have to use the racial proxy on behalf of the argument of expanding opportunity, reducing inequality and whatnot. I'm just going to ask a question because I don't know the answer to it. Exactly how disadvantaged are African American admittees benefiting from affirmative action at elite institutions just as a socioeconomic descriptor? What's the average education of their parents? What kind of high schools did they go to, as a matter of fact? Because the failing public schools in the big cities of this country, where a lot of African Americans are or are not being educated, are not the source feeders of applicants into these elite venues. So are we, are we freighting too much onto race as a identifier of the kind of social inequities that we want to address. Are we too much in the 20th century is what I'm saying, and not enough in the 21st century, where the historical backdrop is definitely racial exclusion and discrimination, but gosh, generations have gone by and a new social reality presents itself to us. So I ask, is this really a racial problem that you're trying to?
I'm glad you bring this up, because I think we can learn a lot about why we think what we think about affirmative action from interrogating what we think about the, I think, typically far less controversial question of whether universities should have something like affirmative action applied to applicants of low socioeconomic status, more broadly construed. And my sense is support for that kind of policy, even among opponents of affirmative action, is pretty broad. That people think it might be a good thing for universities to say, if you came from a background where you simply didn't have access to a school with its hard courses, or you didn't have parents who could supply tutoring, or whatever it is, that those might be considerations we want to think about, orthogonal to race or not. But we might want to think about those in admissions. And I think if that's true, it tells us some things about some of the arguments we've been entertaining, right? Because the argument, for example, that we should simply admit the students with the highest test scores who are going to do the best work doesn't like that either, right? Whereas the value-added argument really might. We might say, look, we actually can identify some excellent talent who's going to get a lot out of the college education by accounting for. So we learned something there, I think, about affirmative action. It's interesting to think about the stigmatization argument, and I am interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I think a difference between being low socioeconomic status and your race is how observable it is to the rest of the audience. If you're specially selected because you came from a low socioeconomic status, I can't immediately know that upon seeing you, but if you're selected based on your race, I might be able to make strong. So I think the stigmatization stuff has sort of different valency. Anyway, I'm interested in both of your thoughts about socioeconomic status-based affirmative action versus race, and if you feel differently about them, what that tells you about how you're thinking about affirmative action by race.
Well, for me, part of it is I think that the injustices with respect to race are so much more powerful than well, the general socioeconomic ones that makes it salient. So Glenn brought up a very important question, which is what information in addition to race should we think about in an affirmative action policy? And so I don't, in other words, one could have looked at, class versus race as a statement that you would use the latter. A different idea is to say that we have a more nuanced view of the role of ethnicity in affirmative action that respects something about backgrounds. Now, in answering but then you brought up another question, was how do we think about the high schools, for example, of the students? And I don't have a good answer to that, but what I'm concerned about is a couple of things. One of them, as I said, it seemed to me that there was evidence that students who are admitted to pretty distinguished schools, students of color, are subject to forces, influences, which are not about their ability that they're bringing in. It simply means they're not doing so well because of issues of identity, of self-confidence. Now, you could say affirmative action damages that because of the stigmatization, but it seems to me that if it is the case that these low-cost interventions that have been studied in the social psychology literature are as efficacious as the ones I know, that's a statement there's something going on that's race-specific. The second thing, which is going to be, I want to bring up as a kind of a broader question, is that in looking at kind of black-white inequality dynamics, a lot of the focus is unsurprisingly on disadvantaged African Americans and the probabilities of moving up. But there's another fact that seems to me extremely important, which is there's qualitatively higher downward mobility in the children of successful African Americans. And so if we were to then sort of ask, what are the factors that are leading to that, they seem to be to speak to affirmative action also as a mechanism that's somehow addressing these whatever these social forces, societal forces are that are making downward mobility more likely. Now, in saying that, I'm being a little sloppy because I haven't specified what I think the candidates are.
Candidates for what, excuse me?
For this high level of downward mobility amongst children of successful African Americans versus whites. And so again, what I have in my head is, as I said, this model in which our objective is, and it via, hopefully ultimately via self-correction, the test scores, the capacity to have equal distributions of things where race is not an independent predictor. But I think that given the evidence of to repeat what I said before, that the absence of convergence on all these things since the 1990s, combined with this downward mobility fact, says to me there's something that needs to be addressed, but that also seems to be a university admissions issue.
Not a cultural issue?
I don't know. In other words, and this is a place, well, I'm going to that.
I mean, I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying it could be.
I agree. But I am also making my belief, at least on the interventions, was it was a statement about the spoiled identities you talked about in your book. That's a rhetorical cheap trick to bring up one of Len's arguments. But the serious point is that maybe students are harmed by that, and so their responses to adverse events are qualitatively different. That's what I took from the Texas studies. But I put on the table that you brought up something. This is absolutely fundamental. If we see the children of successful families not doing well and having test score differences, we have to ask why, and that has to be relevant to any argument I make on justice.
Okay. Yeah, I accept that. I mean, it looks like a pretty hard problem to me.
Stephen, I'm confused about your notion of justice.
So am I.
Yeah, okay. I know, because I'm not teaching it this year, but I know the analytical politics 1 students are out there thinking Stephen's making arguments about Ronald Dworkin, and they're all getting ready to ask you a question about Ronald Dworkin, which is very exciting for them. When you talk about justice early on, and then in your response to me telling me that that you're not making a consequentialist argument, that you have, and then so you have in mind this notion, right, that we have. Sometimes when you talk about justice, you have in mind this notion that we have predictably unequal outcomes that are the result of a history of discrimination, and you have in mind some sort of rectification of that through equality of opportunity, which seems like a very sort of bone standards, sort of standard notion of justice and a reasonable kind of argument. And then you start talking about, okay, so suppose what happens is we rectify a situation, somebody's successful, and then we have mean reversion for their kids or something like that. This seems unjust. And so I'm trying to figure out, I guess, and that's not quite fair, because you're saying it's systematically bigger for one group than another, right? It's not just that there's mean reversion, but there's predictably larger fall off for the children of successful black people than for the children of successful white people. And so is the way you want to think about that argument that also is evidence of injustice because you have in mind that both of these facts reflect deep structure? Or is it just that it just doesn't seem, are we getting to outcomes instead of opportunities, I guess is what I'm really asking. Like, did the criterion change and did it become about outcomes instead of about opportunities?
My criterion in my head didn't change, but the way I articulated it did, and you're correct to bring it up. What's the link between opportunities and outcomes? I mean, again, one has some model, some determination of socioeconomic outcomes, and there are going to be some factors we think are just and some we think are not. And so I put on the table the following ideas. One, the stuff you're not responsible for, that is a prima facie unjust one. Another would be the things, but that doesn't really deal with the issues of desert and merit, but at least it's an idea. And so my belief was that the fact of the history, that's an overwhelming example of something that was not only you're not responsible for it, but the fact, its nature was so horrible that it demands rectification. I then want to make a second argument that is, if we make the observation that we have substantially higher probabilities of downward mobility for successful African Americans, that is suggestive of other features of the structure that to me are inhibiting equality of opportunity, because it means that there's something that's differentially affecting black and white adolescents that they're not responsible for. So that's how I would try to square the circle there. Now, Glenn is correct in saying that's a very vague statement, because I was defining everything in terms of probabilities and what can be predicted using certain variables. I haven't given what you really want are mechanisms. In other words, if one makes an argument that this mechanism, which derived from a historical injustice, you can transmit to the differential today, that's a very clean one. If I'm making an argument that there is something in American society where the capacity of adolescents to formulate the self-esteem, to formulate the sense of belonging, et cetera, is different because of contemporary racial attitudes or the legacy of the past ones, that's a much harder thing to quantify, and it obviously sounds speculative. And that's why when I was bringing up evidence, I switched the story. I said, we have some interventions which seem to be suggestive of something. But I want to be clear, it's not dispositive. And I think that what then this raises is a fundamentally important question, which is understanding contemporary inequalities at different socioeconomic percentiles and what that says about the society. Is it culture? Is it the residue of racial prejudice in the United States, or what? And obviously I'm in no position to say anything strong about that.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there anything to be learned from the outsized success of certain identifiable ethnic/racial subgroups of the population that's relevant to the assessment of the problematic experience of other identifiable groups? As I say, the numbers have to add up to one. If I have underrepresentation, I also have quote unquote overrepresentation. So that's about cause. Is there anything that I can learn from looking at the overrepresentation of Jews in elite academic climates, or of Asians, quote unquote, in elite academic climates that's relevant here? I don't say there is, I just ask. On the normative side, is the underrepresentation of African Americans ipso facto an indictment of the moral order? I don't see that that's necessarily the case. If it is, then is the overrepresentation of this or that group likewise, on the flip side, a representation of some nepotism, some unfairness, some special treatment that advantages them? I think the answer to that, well, I should not ask and answer the question.
You should definitely ask and answer the question.
Supposing that the answer to that is no, the outsized success of certain identifiable populations does not legitimately cause them to be indicted for unfair practice, but then it would seem to follow from that my certainty that the underrepresentation of other groups is itself evidence of some kind of social unfairness. Do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, it seems to me that group egalitarianism, which is the thing that stalks this whole discussion, we want equality between groups, is almost a contradiction in terms, because a fact of group difference in identity, difference in culture and practice, difference in norms of expectations, of peer group associations, of parenting styles, of whatever, are constituent of what it means to be this group as opposed to that group. And given that those things are distinct, because we have distinct groups, how is it that I should expect, in the absence of some kind of morally problematic structure, that there would be equal outcomes? I don't think we should necessarily expect that. So I'm trying to interrogate the overarching normative presuppositions here, that I'm going to learn something about the fairness of structure from the counting exercise in terms of the representation of people in these elite venues of competitive and academic performance.
Yeah. So I think they're going to switch to, there was a hint to switch to questions. Let me just give a reaction, if I might.
Yeah, sure.
I fully agree that numerical equality is not, that was never what I was talking about. I think that the gaps that would exist in absence of the policy are sufficiently large that it's hard for me to see an ascription of them to factors outside the types of injustices that I've talked about. Put differently, I think of affirmative action actually as more as a rectification of an injustice than, let's say, kind of the ideal thing moving towards justice. And I think the experience of African Americans in that sense really is unique. And so for me, it doesn't follow that I'm concerned about other groups being overrepresented. I'm concerned about a particular group that was historically mistreated and wronged being grossly underrepresented, but I don't see any particular reasons for equalization. And let me just also add to that, I think that something that I should be on the table is I think Harvard was guilty. They did discriminate against Asian Americans. They misunderstood the interpretation of the, it's one thing to say that I want to affirmatively act in one group's behalf, but however, to disprivilege another group on dubious personality scores, I think that's also prima facie discrimination.
Here, here. I'm confused by that answer. You would like them to have equally downrated everybody, other than, I mean, as Glenn says, there's an adding up constraint.
Yes, there was not.
You don't like that they in particular discriminated against Asians?
Yes, they did it, and I think that the reason that they did it, which was the use of these interview personality traits, was completely inappropriate. I think they were guilty. I would have liked the Supreme Court to say Harvard's guilty, North Carolina's guilty, and Harvard's guilty, and end the discussion. I think that the broader decision is the one that I think will be socially undesirable.
All right, so I think we should open up to questions. There are microphones, so I think if you raise your hand, somebody will come around. And do you need me to point, or there's many. Everywhere you go, there's hands.
Thank you. So I wanted to maybe fixate on something all of you have been sort of referring to, and that is the historical dimension of racial oppression. What about in the present day? If there is anything going on that might perturb the both of you that has to do with racial oppression, could that be the basis for keeping affirmative action? We've been talking about the historical effects, the long shadow of racial oppression, but I don't know. There's some things going on now, and I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about that.
Well, I want to defer to Glenn because he's written quite extensively about mass incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things going on. I don't, yeah. I don't think that those things that are going on, so the overrepresentation of African Americans amongst those incarcerated, the issues about police violence and the brutality issues and so forth, I don't see that they connect to this question that we're talking about here, which is affirmative action in higher education admissions or more broadly. These are things that are going on. They're complicated and problematic within themselves. I mean, they're not straightforward issues. I mean, for example, in my argument about mass incarceration, I say, look, you did the crime, you do the time, that's one kind of answer, but it's not an adequate answer. Yeah, this guy might have done that crime, but what about the social conditions in which he's embedded, for which we're all responsible, not just he himself? I say you can decide a million cases rightly, each one individually. That's a hypothetical. Let's suppose that the courts and the processing of cases is fairly administered and not racially discriminatory. And you can still end up with a great wrong having been perpetrated. I say, you started down this road, whether it's the war on drugs or 3 strikes and you're out or whatever it is, and maybe you didn't know when you started down this road that it was going to lead to the hyper-incarceration of particular communities in a manner that was grotesque. But you should have been able to see after a bit that you had started down a road leading to a grotesque outcome. And maybe the reason that you didn't see, reconsider, and alter your course of action was because the people most subject to those actions were people that you didn't value that much. They weren't like you. They weren't people about whom you said, oh my God, look what we're doing to them. So that's all part of the story here. I'm not at all reluctant about acknowledging that. But how do I get from that to affirmative action in higher education admissions?
Thanks for the discussion. One question that I wanted to ask about is going back to the purpose of the university, and a lot of the attention in this discussion, in this case, is on so-called elite universities, and they are like a very small fraction of the higher education system. But they have a significant overrepresentation in places of power, such as the Supreme Court. It's not a random draw of people who are in the Supreme Court who become president and things like that. So in terms of when you think about meritocracy and scientific discovery and what test scores should do to determine who gets access to that route, if you also look at where a lot of attention is focused, a couple of institutions, and those being the routes towards power and society, would that alter how you think about what the elite university is doing? One of the things it's doing is it allocating these slots, and should that just be based on, should matters of broad representation across racial groups be a consideration when you're thinking about those positions that are not, to me, clearly just allocated based on merit?
I think it's another dimension of what I brought up in terms of the composition of the individuals in a society, in terms of medicine or teaching. I think you brought up another example, and this is it's what I call a bottleneck. In other words, these elite schools are something of a bottleneck to various positions of power. And so, 8 of the 9 justices went to Harvard or Yale Law School, and it was only the most recent one that didn't, so that's an easy example. I think that there's evidence, for example, you look at elite law firms, that they're very disproportionately concentrated African-American employees amongst elite schools, et cetera. And so I see some, that is another dimension of the argument that in terms of thinking about the value added of the admissions, that we have lots of things in our society afterwards that are positional. And so the value of representation there strikes me as very high.
I think affirmative action presupposes elitism. I'm reminded of Bowen and Bach, The Shape of the River. That's a book from 25 years ago. The former presidents, respectively, of Princeton University, Bill Bowen, and Harvard University, Derek Bach. And they undertook an empirical analysis of a longitudinal data set that was gathered of students matriculating at elite universities, and then followed into their early careers so that it could be observed what occupational and income and other kinds of social value added they were able to contribute. And they said, in effect, we're gatekeepers of these portals into the American elite. It's good for our country that the American elite be racially diverse, and so we're going to engage in some affirmative action here. Yes, there are some compromises that we make, but on the whole, the net benefit is a good thing. I'm also thinking of Justice Antonin Scalia, who commented in one of the University of Michigan cases, I think it was the law school case, that you don't have to be so elite. The only reason you're engaging in racial discrimination is because you predetermine that a person has to be at the 93rd percentile of the distribution of LSAT test takers before they get any attention from your university. There are not enough blacks at the 93rd percentile, and so you have to go down, and so now you're discriminating. But you don't have to be so elite. And I'm thinking that, you mentioned the Supreme Court and where people go to law school, that these things are kind of connected with one another. If rationing of access at stage N+1 depends upon being in the elite location at stage N, there's going to be a lot of pressure to diversify people who are at stage N in order to be able to get access to stage N+1. I'm not sure it's a good thing that our processes of determination of, for example, who can sit on the Supreme Court doesn't get outside of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. I'm not sure that that's
and
at all a good thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot Chicago. I meant to say Chicago. I'm not sure it's a good thing, but given that that's the fact, there's going to be a lot of pressure to get people from diverse communities into these portals. So those things are kind of linked to each other in my mind.
Good evening. My question is, I'm back here behind a pillar, if you can see me. My question is about the incongruency between what affirmative action, or who affirmative action policies were designed for, and then who actually benefits from them. It's been said that white women are the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action policy. So my question is, in either of your arguments, do you guys consider how implementation of these policies shapes the demographic of universities?
Well, I think we certainly should consider it. In other words, your point is very well taken, and that is that there's many dimensions to think about this. I may have misunderstood you. I thought the biggest beneficiary is now white men. In other words, no, I mean that seriously. In other words, the increasing gap in test scores between white men and women has led to another dimension of affirmative action, de facto, as we understand it. I think the point you bring up is, is very important, and it's part of the general issue that it's one thing to say in principle one supports affirmative action, but it doesn't answer the question of how you structure it. And so I made an objection, as an example, to Harvard's treatment of Asian Americans in the admissions process, and that to me is logically decoupled from the desire to have representation of African Americans. And so, but one can go down the list and then asking those types of questions. I would emphasize that historically, if there was another dimension to affirmative action, which had to do with gender, and I think there were very good reasons to do it, that in some sense, that's a little bit of the ideal. In other words, the test score gap's self-corrected. In other words, the issue now is flipped. And so I take your comment as a friendly amendment that we have to think very hard about the specifics of the policies.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think historically it's true that there was a lot of concern about underrepresentation of white women in certain, in law and medicine and graduate education and in the STEM disciplines and so forth. And that was part of the impetus to affirmative action for white women. But I think as the decades have gone by, those disparities have significantly diminished. And I think, as you point out, tacit affirmative action probably is going in the other direction, that is for men, not women, at least in undergraduate admissions. But I think the fundamental point is that race is different from sex or gender. There's the 14th Amendment. I'm talking about the law. I'm not a lawyer, but this is my impression of how the argument is going in the court. There's something special about racial discrimination. I'm not sure that the same interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment would come into play. I say I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm raising the question in terms of assessing affirmative action by gender. Now, the other thing that I would say is that, and I thought this might be where the questioner was going, when you call people black, you haven't necessarily given a full description of their history. There are lots of different kinds of black people, not just descendants of American slavery and Jim Crow segregation. We're an open society here. There are immigrants, second generation, third generation, and so on. And one could raise the question of whether or not the rationale for affirmative action matches up with the actual practice of affirmative action, even if you restricted attention to blacks. Because the rationale is about the long shadow cast by a history of racial exclusion. But the demographic fact of the matter, at least at places like the one that I teach at, is that a non-trivial fraction of the black students who are in the university community are not the descendants of slaves. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the case.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year MPP from Harris School. I just want to connect this whole thing with the affirmative action in terms of race and also in terms of caste, because there is, universities like Harvard, Columbia, UC Berkeley also included caste as a protected category. Seattle also came up with that. You're right. demographic tectonics of America is changing, the new immigrants who are coming from source population, and they are talking about meritocracy. But for example, in Indian diaspora, the more than 90% diaspora of India who are settling in America are from minority sections of India who are upper caste. And the 90%, 80% of Indian population who are the lower caste do not have access to even immigrate or to access Stanford, Harvard, UChicago, MIT. So my question is, these people who are right now talking about meritocracy, their merit is also a byproduct of their own social and cultural capital, their own social and historical mobilization which they had from generations. I am a scholarship holder from India. I can come here from India and educate myself in UChicago, but a black kid from South Side can't come and get education here. That shows that the access of ability to get into this university, for me, can happen because of affirmative action, but can't be there for the American citizen who lives in South Side. My question is, can we say that the merit is also a byproduct of your social, cultural capital? Because unless and until, at least I have opportunity to create my capital, social capital, at least first time in my life. My next generation will benefit, but that opportunity is robbed from a kid from South Side. So can we say the merit is your social, cultural, intergenerational capital? Thank you.
Yes. I don't mean to be flippant. I don't know a lot about caste in India. I did read a book by two sociologists, Min Zhou and Jennifer Lee, called The Asian American Achievement Paradox. They interviewed families in Southern California trying to figure out how these kids get into Dartmouth and Cornell and Columbia at such high rates. And a lot of the book was chronicling the cultural capital that was reflected in the home life and social life of these young people. So I don't have an extended response, but I think the observation that cultural capital is important is correct.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And there's, this is part of, I would say, the existing social science mysteries is if we're conditioning on successful families and seeing downward mobility, I don't think we have good explanations for it. I gave you some interpretations, but they're surely rebuttable. And I could imagine, because the evidence is far from decisive. But what you brought up also, just you kind of maybe to close the conversation, it brings up something Glenn raised, which is that you look at different ethnic groups in America, they have very different, there's lots of heterogeneity in achievements. And so there are clearly, ways to map that back to differences in social norms, in terms of culture, partly in terms of the self-selection of immigrants, et cetera. And so there's surely information, all of that, and understanding how to unravel this mystery of what I'm calling and the predictive value of the past injustices.
Glenn, can I just put a finer point on this a little bit? Your response was yes. Is this the kind of thing then that you have in mind when you say, look, the groups are different and what it means to be a group is different, that we ought not as a society to be trying to iron out? Or is it the sort of thing we ought to be trying to iron out as a society, the accumulated social capital or the accumulated cultural capital, but we ought not be doing it at the level of affirmative action in higher ed?
That's a hard question in my mind. I mean, the stipulation, groups are different. Call it culture or cultural capital or something. I don't want to get into an argument with anybody, but groups are different. Now, is that a matter of public business? That is, in my mind, a hard question. I mean, suppose you talk about family structure. Is it the government's concern about whether or not people get married, stay married, how they raise their children, whether fathers are in the home and stuff like that? Moynihan tried to raise that issue 60 years ago, got his head handed to him. So can I say something else? Unless Steve wants to address.
You're the distinguished guest. You can say whatever you want.
I want to go back to the issue of dignity and stigma. So Georgetown Law Center, couple of years ago. Sandra Sellers, that's the name of a woman who was a lecturer in a negotiation class, who into an open mic was heard to say, she didn't know she was being taped, you know, every year it's the same thing. The kids who cluster at the bottom of my class are disproportionately kids of color. It breaks my heart to see it. I don't know what to do about it, but that's the case, she says. Precipitating a firestorm of complaint because a student, it went out on a Zoom thing and she didn't know it was going out, and then it went on Twitter or whatever, and there was a big firestorm at Georgetown Law Center. She was fired. Her co-teacher, who was a party to the conversation and who did not object to her statement, which was a report of what she observed in her classroom, was also relieved of duty. The school went through a whole internal process of examining the structural racism of Georgetown law, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is an anecdote. This is just one instance. Could she be the only person to notice who's at the bottom of her class and what the racial identity of those people are? Did anybody really believe the structural racism stuff that was being bandied about after, or was that a cover story that made it politically convenient to allow this moment to pass as Georgetown went through a navel-gazing self-examination? Is that scenario being repeated in other law schools, medical schools around the country? I happen not to know. I want to know, is that anything on the cost side of the ledger when we think about the instruments that we employ to address real problems, but that create circumstances after the fact that might not be beautiful? Just a set of
Well, I
questions.
would just, I think that those are important things to bring up. Affirmative action, as I said before, it does not create a tabula rasa. It doesn't wipe out the history of individuals, what schools they went to, what experiences they had, what social issues of the cost of prejudice, et cetera. And so I think that universities have done an extremely poor job of recognizing that and asking what comes after. In other words, it is a component. It's one policy in a portfolio, and I think that there has been this tendency. It's very expensive to address these things, and just to sort of wave them away and then tell a story, as was done about this lecture, I think is inappropriate. I probably shouldn't reveal this in public because it was not public data. But once at the University of Wisconsin, I saw some of the statistics on graduation rates within 6 years for different groups. And there was one group of African Americans with modest test scores that had excellent graduation rates, and it was athletes. Now, this was not because of corruption. It was because the athletic department systematically provided tutors and monitoring, et cetera, that made sure that, make sure people were getting work done on time and were helping them. That's expensive. And so the issue again was not that that these students shouldn't have been in Wisconsin. They were doing fine afterwards, but it was you have to recognize that the differences in test scores, they are not, to try to dismiss them as some, imperfection of the test is the wrong way to think. The tests are noisy signals. They do reflect schools for taking tests, high school background, et cetera. But they also have information in them. And successful affirmative action policies must respect the students and the need to have the skills to excel at the school. So on that, I think we're in absolute agreement.
So we are at time. I think this is a good place to stop because we ended on a story about data and a policy intervention that could be subject to program evaluation. So now we feel like we're at a Harris School event. I'm not sure we came to agreement, but I hope we came to a little more understanding. Please join me in thanking Stephen and Glenn for an enlightening conversation.